I think the most important thing that they're going to get out of staying is knowing where they are, knowing what's, they've had that situation for a long time. There's going to be no shocks from staying within the European Union. There have been some really good benefits from being in the EU for motorists. I know you've acknowledged some of those yourself, Quentin, the fact that there used to be a disparity between how much people were paying to buy a car in the UK and the rest of Europe. Thanks to European regulation, that changed. There's more transparency, there's more fairness about getting your car serviced. So I think we would be foolish to allow those things to disappear. That doesn't mean that we couldn't do better out of Europe, and of course the UK government has a really important role in standing up for drivers and in making sure that the EU delivers for drivers in the UK and across the whole of the continent of Europe. Well, let's remember why VAT is at 20% on fuel, and that's because the current government, having said back in 2010 that they had no plans to increase VAT, of course came in and immediately put VAT up by 2.5%. And of course the government have the flexibility, if they want to and if the nation's finances allow, to reduce VAT on fuel as on anything else down as far as 15%. And of course the last Labour government, after the economic shock in 2008, did exactly that in order to stimulate the economy. It's right to say that there are rules around VAT within the EU, but I think it holds out a false promise to people to suggest somehow that if we were outside the EU that we're going to see VAT reduced down to 15%. If we left the European Union, it would have such a significant impact on our economy that far from having money to spend, to make choices to spend more or to reduce taxes, actually there would be a black hole in the nation's finances. Well, for the reasons you've said, which is that the fuel duty is different in different countries. In the UK we pay the same duty on both diesel and petrol, and it's at a relatively high level at sort of 58p at the moment. But the thing is, it's about the choices that national government make. I know you interviewed Boris Johnson not so long ago, and it was back in 2011, I think, that he said it's a matter for governments. Governments could choose to vary fuel duty, as indeed they have done. The EU is not preventing them from doing that. It's about the government's finances, and it's about the choices that our government makes.
French consumers.
Well, maybe that's a question that we should be asking of government, and obviously government can go and make arguments about EU regulation in its role as in the Council of Ministers and through the European Parliament. It's a question of what the government chooses to do. Of course, if we come out of the EU, those rules will be made without us having any say in them, and if we want to stay part of the single market, we have to be subject to the rules. I think for most drivers what they're concerned about is the price they're paying when they go along and fill their car up, and that price that you pay is largely determined by the choices that our government here in the UK makes. And I think, you know, FairFuel have done a lot of work to lobby government ministers about those issues, and you're having a great deal of influence on that, and you will continue to do that whether we're members of the European Union or not, because it is government who can determine the prices that we pay at the pumps. Well, look, I'm a Labour representative, and we've been very critical of the government for the state of our roads. We know there's a £12 billion backlog of roads maintenance on local roads that are going to take 14 years potentially to clear. So I certainly sympathise with that view. It's certainly something I hear from my constituents, and other people do too. But the reason why we've got such a backlog is because of the choices that government have made about spending, and in real terms, spending on local roads maintenance incidence fell 27% in the last Parliament, so not surprisingly that backlog has got worse. Now, of course, when it comes to the European Union, we've also benefited in terms of our roads from some of the EU spending. For example, the work on the M25 widening benefited from European Investment Bank funding to the tune of £500 million. I think the upgrade of the M8 between Glasgow and Edinburgh also benefited from EU funding, and there's an access road to Port Talbot steel plant that benefited from EU funding. But essentially, these are decisions for national government and national spending. The EU, the funds that we spend on our membership of the EU are small in compared with our overall government spending, and it's about the choices that we make. Perhaps that governments in other European countries choose to invest money in keeping their roads to a decent standard rather than spending things on other public services. And as I say, it's been hugely cut, and like many ordinary motorists, I share that concern about the state of our local roads. I'm blaming it on the choices that the Conservative government have made, particularly in the last few years, that's leading to local authorities being unable to maintain roads to the standards that we would like. And in terms of our major roads, we know that the Highways England have promised that there'll be resurfacing of 80% of our motorways, but it's unclear whether they'll be able to meet that target. Well, as I've said, there's an argument about how much money we would actually have to spend. The £350 million a week figure that's going around on the side of the Leave bust has been discredited. The chair of the UK Statistics Authority described it as misleading. But even if we agreed a figure, and maybe I'd suggest it's nearer to £120 million a week, where would that money be spent? Vote Leave have suggested that they would spend it on the NHS and on reducing domestic fuel costs for home heating and the like. My contention is that the overall impact of leaving the EU on our economy would be so serious that we would not have money to spend on our roads or indeed on anything else. Actually, the real risk is that we'd be having to have spending cuts, greater austerity or tax rises in order to tackle that black hole in our economic position. Well, of course, people worry about the state of the world economy, and they worry about what's happening in Europe. But as I say, when we look at the implications of a Leave vote next Thursday, when people are weighing that up about what they would get if they chose to vote Leave, I think we have to look at the implications for our economy and what expert economists are telling us. And of course there's a balance that some people will say it's going to be very bad, and some people will say, well, it'll be bad and then it might get better. But the overwhelming 90% of economic forecasters are telling us that this would be bad for the UK economy, that it risks tipping us back into recession. And I think that's a very real concern that people should be aware of when they're making the decision about how to vote. Well, I don't think that's the state of play at the moment. What we know is that there's a vote coming up next week, and the people of the UK are making a choice, and they know that potentially this vote risks serious financial implications for the UK economy, for all of our taxes, for spending on our public services, and I think that's what people are rightly focused on.
What about the emissions scandal? Now, this was done under European Commission watch, and they got it badly wrong. They set our emission targets for the whole of Europe. They set up a monitoring regime, and that regime was not fit for purpose. And we know that the German car companies put more and more pressure on the EU to water down this low CO2 remit. They got it spectacularly wrong. Do we really want them to be looking after a new emissions regime? Why can't we do it ourselves?
Well, look, I think we should acknowledge some of the positives, which is that the European emissions targets have led to, for example, on buses, we've got 95% of buses now much cleaner and greener. So that's a positive. Clearly, everyone is shocked by what happened with VW. They deliberately set out to deceive the regulators, not just in Europe, but also in the US. And I'm disappointed with the response of the European Union in terms of the tougher new emissions targets, where they're allowing this up to 50% up in 2020 above the limits.
But that's because the Germans kind of put pressure on the European Commission because of all their car factories.
Well, I think our government have been too slow to act on this issue. They've been not secured compensation for VW drivers in this country. I'd like the government to have been doing more, and I've been critical of that situation that's been allowed to continue. Clearly, we need to work together to tackle air quality issues and to improve the issue around diesel emissions.
But shouldn't we be doing this ourselves?
Well, I think there are things that we could already be doing. The idea of a diesel scrappage scheme is one of the things that's been floated. We know that the government have said that they're looking at it. They haven't done a proper assessment of the last car scrappage scheme that we had in this country, and of course we introduced that without it having to be an EU thing. We did that back under the last Labour government. I think they should be looking at that. They should be sharing that information with us, and then we can see how can we move to a situation where we get some of the most polluting diesel vehicles off our roads.
Because let's remember, it was the EU that made us worship the altar of global warming, of climate change with CO2, and completely ignored the particulates and the PM10s in diesel pollution, which effectively made the whole of the British car population change over to diesel. I mean, 50% people switched because they thought it was the right thing, the green thing to do. Now, the EU has some responsibility for the air pollution issues we have now, particularly in London. Are we really going to let them take control again to sort it out?
Well, look, I think we were right to try to tackle the issue of carbon emissions. I think that was important, and clearly you can't tackle climate change and emissions on a single country basis. We need to work with others to tackle the big issues that affect more than one nation. But I'd have to agree that clearly in focusing on tackling carbon emissions, we've allowed the focus to move away from tackling particulates and NOx emissions, and now everyone needs to focus on how we do that effectively.
That came from the EU, so my point is that I have no confidence in their view on how we control emissions and how we help these poor, beleaguered, hard-working motorists who were forced to change their cars from petrol to diesel in the hope of reducing global warming. And now they find themselves with cars that may be having higher VED and certainly are polluting more than they dreamed of.
Well, look, it was our government that made the changes back in 2001 that have led to that difference. But
it was led by the EU, wasn't it?
Well, I think, our understanding and scientific knowledge has certainly improved since then, and we obviously do appreciate better now the health implications of particulates and NOx, and something that we need to tackle. But I say we're better tackling it collectively.
I think you're apologising for Brussels. They should have known. They spend all this money, the amount of money spent on emissions research, and they miss this hugely salient point that diesel is black and sooty and we breathe it in.
I'm not apologising. I'm saying I think that they were right to focus on cutting carbon emissions. I think the impact of not appreciating the impact of diesel particulates and NOx is something that we now do understand, and we need to tackle it, and that's why I've been pressing the government to get to grips with this and look at how we are going to change that, how we are going to make our cities cleaner, and how we're going to tackle that air quality crisis that clearly we face in some of our major cities.
But you can understand how myself and our followers lack confidence in the EU's ability to sort the quality of our own air. Surely we should be determining the quality of the air we breathe, not Brussels.
Well, I think we should be working collectively to tackle the issue of emissions. If we did all that within our own country, then that would lead to an increase in prices, because the testing regime is funded through a levy. At the moment, we share information between different countries. Certainly the UK has been working closely with Germany on this issue of emissions testing. If we did it all within this country, clearly the cost would fall on British motorists. Well, I think we need to look at how we best support our haulage industry, but our haulage industry depends on our trade with Europe. I think if our trade with Europe decreased, then obviously that would have a very direct impact on our road hauliers and on their jobs and the work that they undertake. I've heard Nigel Farage talking about we should be doing more trade with the rest of the world, perhaps with Commonwealth countries. Well, that seems to me a recipe for there being less work for our hauliers and perhaps more work for shipping, and that's something that would be concerning me if I was a road haulage firm. Well, I think it's really important that the government listen to the voice of hauliers, listen to their concerns and attempt to address those things. But I think that's largely something we can do within the UK. But so we can do that through the negotiations that we have as a member of the European Union. Maybe our government needs to be standing up for our haulage industry a bit more.